Tonight we're going to be talking about social immobility and civic participation. This continues our program series about the ways that citizens can address contemporary threats to democracy and the social contract, called The Health of Democracy. Our forum tonight will be led by Joey Mokos. Joey graduated from the Yale Divinity School and began his career as a labor organizer after completing a summer interfaith internship working for Worker Justice. He is currently Regional Director for Healthcare Delivery for Unite Here.
The American dream, the notion that anyone in America can get ahead with hard work, is out of grasp for the majority of Americans. Polls show that Americans no longer regularly expect a rising standard of living. Is the idea of upward mobility down the tubes? What does this mean for a healthy democracy in the age of Citizens United? What limits American working people's expectations? In a time of declining unions and increasing healthcare costs, what is the effect on families? How are unions responding? These are some of the questions that we will address in our conversation. Randy Albelda is a professor of economics and senior research fellow at the Center for Social Policy at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She has worked as the research director of the Massachusetts State Senate's Taxation Committee and the legislature's Special Commission on Tax Reform. We welcome to the Cambridge Forum, Randy Albelda.
So, as you said, I was asked to address how does social or economic immobility threaten the social contract and health of democracy. So, as Joey said, my work tends to focus on poverty. So this notion of social mobility is sort of an interesting connection between poverty. But actually, I'm going to talk a lot about inequality tonight. So what I want to first do is talk about why this topic matters so much. Then I'm going to ask the question, has there really been any change in economic mobility over the last 30 years? And then I'm going to talk about the connection of social mobility and inequality. And I'm going to argue the real threat to democracy is growing inequality as opposed to immobility. And then I'll talk a little bit about the problems, but also some of the prospects and opportunities that this particular moment brings with thinking about both inequality and social mobility. So since I'm being recorded, I'm going to read more than I usually do, but we'll see how that goes. So this is an important question and one that is of increasing concern to what I would call the mainstream. And even conservative leaders. I don't know if you remember a few weeks ago when Mitt Romney sent out his lead balloon, but the core of that lead balloon was thinking about poverty and inequality. So even someone who we tend to think of as fairly conservative and really rich has become concerned with this. And there's good reason. Economic and social mobility, at least for some, has been a hallmark of U.S. values. As you said before, this is apparent in Horatio Alger's stories of the 19th century, of rags to riches. The strong belief that anyone that works hard, has a great idea, or in today's parlance has grit, can succeed in America. There's a sense that who we are born to matters less than what we can become. That is especially true in light of the waves of new immigrants to the United States, that we can do better than our parents and our children can do better than us. In short, economic social mobility is shorthand for economic opportunity. And everyone is for that. It fills the narratives of almost every person that runs for office, regardless of their affiliation. We are particularly drawn in by stories of those whom have succeeded but come from very little. And in Massachusetts, when I was thinking about talking, two came immediately to mind. Former Governor Patrick Duvall, raised by a low-income single mom, and the most recent is Senate President Stan Rosenberg, who was a foster kid left on his own at age 18 and completed college when he was close to 30. So, you know, these are great stories, right? And both of those are first, so we like that even better, right? Patrick is the first black governor of Massachusetts, and Rosenberg the first Jewish state president. So Many of us, including myself, have stories like this. I teach at UMass Boston, which I have to say is the embodiment of not only stories like this, but dreams like this. So it is, in many ways, our own image of ourselves. And so that if opportunity, economic opportunity, is systematically blocked, except in the historical cases of a few, and I'll get to those later, it actually threatens our sense of ourselves. And pushes us to ask harder and deeper questions about what are those impediments to mobility. So if social mobility has worsened over the period, then this raises very serious questions about fairness and the idea of level playing fields. In economics, there's a parlance around inequality, and there's a sense that there's a fair inequality and an unfair inequality. And in the distinction is that in fair inequality is a kind of inequality that is actually good for us. It's fair and it's an important feature of US capitalism. Inequality, a fair inequality, provides incentives to work harder, to invent more. This fair inequality is directly connected to an ethos around economic ability. And it's fair because inequality evolves out of hard work, grit, perseverance, etc. So the story goes, if you worked hard and became a doctor, you should earn more than somebody who, spent their college playing cards and drinking and not doing very much. So there's this notion of fair inequality. And it actually survives, I think, because it's directly connected to this notion of mobility. So if you work hard, if you have grit, if you persevere, if you're creative and innovative, you can make it, and a son can do better than a father. So as long as that's true, then some forms of inequality, and I would argue especially poverty, don't become very important economic or social problems. Right? If you can just say they're poor because they didn't work hard or take responsibility, then inequality and even mobility aren't as important or don't seem to create as much concern as blocked mobility, systematic blocked mobility. Economic opportunities that facilitate social mobility allows many to think that the main reason people are poor is that they don't take personal responsibility. They don't try hard enough. They prefer pleasure or consumption today over savings or self-improvement. In short, you get what you deserve. So this notion of social mobility, I think, has important ideological components to it besides economic components that allow many of us to not be as concerned by poverty if that mobility is blocked. Further, this belief seems to help to account for why Americans, more so than, say, Europeans, seem to have an incredibly high tolerance for inequality. So the U.S. will tolerate high inequality as long as there's a belief, or there actually is, or there are enough stories around social mobility. But if social mobility is blocked, or at least a lot of people think it is, these arguments about fair inequality can easily be overtaken by those talking about unfair inequality. So unfair inequality is that, as you said earlier, despite how hard you work, you can't get ahead. And this requires a much deeper look at why we have inequality rather than arguing about the faults of individuals. So unfair inequality will become more of a concern. For liberals and even some conservatives, this turns to discussions of unequal opportunity. And just as an example of where this parlance takes place is the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston in the fall had a big conference that brought in a lot of academics and the head of the Federal Reserve to talk about economic opportunity. There's another one with the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. That's not usually what the Federal Reserve talks about. So it is a concern. But there's others who bring this up in different ways and in different formats who, and the one that comes to mind, and I'll come back to this later, is Senator Elizabeth Warren, who not argues that the system is rigged, that is, that social mobility has been stymied, but she calls into question the individualistic nature of mobility when she reminds us that government provides a great deal of what we need in order to access opportunities. And I'll come back to this because I actually think this is a real consequence of inequality, is these sets of public investments in opportunity. So economic opportunity, immobility does threaten some crucial aspects of the U.S. social contract and psyche. The aspects that we like to believe that fair inequality is what we experience, not unfair inequality. It violates the belief that there are sufficient avenues of opportunities, such as the ability to get a good K through 12 education or school, find a good public school, to attend college if you can get in, and that your life chances are not determined by who your parents were or where you live, but by what you do and how you succeed. So I think it has a crucial notion, ideological notion, and it's often related to increased inequality, I'll get to. But is there any evidence that there's been a change in social or economic mobility over the last 30 years? Economists like empirical evidence. And again, I'm going to focus on two studies, but I focus on two of these largely because they're reputable, but they've been reproduced, so it's not as if the data aren't there. So Americans have a high tolerance for inequality because it has always been tempered by the notion of the American dream, the ability to move on up. Polls certainly indicate that Americans feel that it's harder to move forward. They feel like they're not any better off, and they feel like they're even less likely to call themselves middle class. So at least there's a strong perception. But is there any empirical data? And interestingly enough, two prominent studies argue that there isn't. And let me talk a little bit about that, but what they find. What they find is still, I think, quite important. There's two ways that economists measure mobility, economic mobility. One is what's called intergenerational mobility. That is, are you better off than your parents were? So that, for example, if I was born to a family in the bottom 20 or 25% of the income distributions, what are my chances of being in a different one 20 or 30 years later? So do I move up from when I was born to when I become an adult over time, and so that I'm in a different place than my parents were. The other is what's called intragenerational mobility, and this looks at adults' position on the income or wealth ladder, say 10 years ago versus today. So, or 20 years ago. So it looks at, as an adult, were you able to move forward? Most of the studies, by the way, are intergenerational. They look, and most of them actually look at fathers and sons. Mostly because women's economic mobility is often, not so much now, and I'll come back to this, has always been tied to their father or their husband. So most of the studies have been fathers and sons. That's beginning to change. So, like I said, surprisingly, two very solid studies of both intra and intergenerational mobility have found that over the last 20 years or 30 years, economic mobility has not changed that much. In terms of the intragenerational mobility, two economists, Gregory Axe and Seth Zimmerman, both I think work for the Urban Institute, and this was for the Pew Mobility Project. They looked at people ages 25 to 44 over two 10-year periods, 1984 to 1994, and then 1994 to 2004. And what they found is that about 50% of those in the bottom quintile, the bottom 20%, in 1994 moved up to a higher one in 1994. So over that 84 to 94 period, about 50% moved up. They found almost exactly the same thing the following 10 years. Raj Chetty from Harvard and various co-authors have used, they got a lot of press about a year ago. They used administrative earnings records from the IRS. So they were, that's by the way, that's the data that Piketty uses too, this IRS data. So, and they found for children born between 1971 and 1993 versus their parents, quote, children entering the labor market today have the same chances of moving up in the income distribution relative to their parents as children born in 1970s. So here we are again with economists telling everything we feel isn't really true. But there's some really important caveats and crucial intragroup dynamics that I think actually highlight some very important changes in mobility that do make us feel worse. And actually are important politically and economically. So Axe and Simran in the intragenerational study find that, that there's mobility for some but not for others. So some groups of people are more easily move up out of the bottom and some don't. And the strongest predictor of who moves up in both periods was who had a college degree. What I found, and about a third of those did, which is sort of interesting, only a third with a college degree move out of the bottom quintiles and move up. But there were differences between the two decades. Being white, having a high school diploma, being male, not having a disability, and being married did give one a leg up compared to if you weren't all those things in the earlier period, the 84 to 94. But much less so in the later period. The only new factor that provided more upper mobility in the later period was being in a job where you could set your own hours. So having some job flexibility was one of the few avenues, and not employer flexibility, employee flexibility was one of the few avenues that brought more people up in the latter period than the earlier period. These are interesting because what they say is that one of the driving factors in being in the bottom quintile is, of moving out of the bottom quintile, is having a college education. But all the other quote-unquote traditional barriers we think of are income-reducing situations, including discrimination. Those characteristics seem to matter less. Another way of saying that is there's less of a premium of being a white, married guy in terms of moving up. I take this to mean lack of mobility is now an equal opportunity denier. But that matters, right? It matters who feels that they can move up and who actually can. It points to the importance of access to higher education at a time when the price of education is growing. Chetty et al. Also highlight important aspects of intergenerational mobility, despite not finding much change in it over the last 20 years. While they argue that there's not less social mobility, what they do find is that there's a lot more inequality. And the way that they characterize this, and you can go on the web and look at it, is they have two ladders. One with short rungs and one with really big rungs. And so what they find is that the later period is that the rungs have gotten a lot bigger. So as many people move up the rungs, it's just a bigger leap. It's a lot harder. So what they argue is that there's a lot more inequality, but on aggregate, there's not less mobility. It just takes more to move up the rungs of the ladder. But what's really interesting about their findings, I think, is that they highlight considerable regional differences. And you can actually go on the web and see the map. And what they find is that the least mobile regions, where people move up the least, are in the southeast. And the most mobile regions are the Great Plains. and it varies by city. So the city that has the highest percentage of those in the bottom quartile moving up is Salt Lake City, and the one with the least is Charlotte, North Carolina. But I think more importantly what they do is they then correlate. They're very careful about causation. But they correlate more mobility with regions, Census Bureau regions, that have less racial segregation, less income inequality, better K through 12 schools, higher levels of social capital, and what they call more family stability, measured as a fraction of single parents. So what they're saying is that on the aggregate, there's no change in mobility. But where there is a lot less mobility are in regions and areas and communities that have underinvested in public education, that have very high levels of racial segregation, and that you have more single parent families. And what they carefully argue, which I think is important, is that they find that true of everyone in that region, not just, for example, blacks in highly segregated areas. Both blacks and whites do have less mobility in those areas. Both children of married parents don't have less mobility than those in single mother communities where there are large percentages. This is actually pretty similar to findings that Wilkerson and Pickett, I don't know if any of you are familiar, but the spirit level, they've done a lot of work on inequality and all sorts of social indicators. And they find this true as well. The higher the levels of inequality, the worse outcomes for everybody. So that is the higher level, for example, what they find is the higher levels of inequality means not only do poor people do poorly in terms of health outcomes, but so do rich people. That is, so that inequality actually creates worse conditions, not just for those who are facing the inequality, but for communities as a whole. And I actually think, like I said, I think both of these, despite not finding there's an increase in mobility, I have found really important findings about how this links to both inequality, I would argue, but the importance of this and this notion of democratic values and civic participation. And let me move to that. So I think what they found is important is that inequality has made it more arduous. It's more tiring to move up. And it clearly correlates to mobility and matters at a community level, even maybe more so than at an individual level. So to me, this suggests that understanding inequality is the key to thinking about this issue of social mobility. The data do not suggest a deterioration in mobility, but there's clearly a change in people's perceptions about the ability to make in America. The degree to which social mobility is also linked to high levels of inequality, that is, that a small percentage of the population controls the majority of resources, or a substantial portion of the population is has very little compared to the rest, poses a whole other set of threats to the health of democracy. And there is a correlation. Alan Kruger, who was the head of the Council of Economic Advisors under Obama, he left, he's a Princeton economist. He plotted what's called the Great Gatsby curve, which is just a bunch of data points. And the data points the degree of economic mobility in a country or immobility and the degree of inequality. And what he finds is that they're highly correlated. So the more unequal a society is, the less mobility is. And there has been an undeniable growth in inequality over the U.S. So regardless of what is found about social mobility, it is very well documented that there's been a growth in inequality in the U.S. since the late 1970s. This has been made famous by Thomas Piketty along with Emmanuel Sace using this IRS data. They find that the action is mostly at the top 1%. But inequality, I think, affects people very differently at various levels. And certainly, Chetty et al. Find that the relationship between mobility and inequality that they found was strongest, not when the top 1% was included, but the rest. There's a growing literature that inequality is bad for maintaining, it's not only bad for your health, it's bad for maintaining democracy. And it's somewhat obvious. It distorts legal, political, and economic systems. It's as simple as this. If you have money, you get the best justice, politicians, and access to a host of opportunities that money can buy. Allowing undue political say by those who have with the most money seems to have the clearest, or at least most resonant connection, that inequality stifles democracy. This is translated into unlimited political contributions that favor politicians that maintain inequality, ungodly amounts on lobbyists that promote legislation that mostly favor corporate interests, and well-heeled organizations that specialize in the promotion of state-level legislation that suppresses voting and weakens organized labor. So I think there's, and this has been documented for a long time. I often have my students, although they don't appreciate it as much as I think they should, read an economist called Arthur Okun, who wrote in the 70s. His book was called The Great Trade-Off. But he argues this in 1978, that inequality threatens democracy. But I would say that the rise in inequality has had really important implications because inequality tends to fuel more inequality. So inequality, I would argue, fuels education and housing inequality. Richer people move to areas with better schools, public schools, or opt out entirely, which further segregates community and drives up housing costs because all the money is for building houses for rich people, leaving the housing stock for others unchanged, which bids up the price. We've seen that in the Boston area. It creates stronger conditions and more consequences for what economists like to call, and sociologists, assertive mating. All that means is that you marry somebody, well, you marry people with similar education and income levels as you do, which reduces intra-family mobility. And I would argue that this kind of inequality creates conditions for accumulation for the rich and deaccumulation for everyone else, or at least the bottom half, as you need to go into more debt to go to school or buy a house, as opposed to the top half, or even, that can invest in children's schooling and living situations. So this kind of inequality, I think, in fact, that's a really concerning aspect that I think in some ways people would rather talk about opportunity than they would inequality, but in fact, I think what they're talking about is inequality. So I would argue what's happening is that the rising levels of inequalities have created the conditions for even more inequality, and that's fueling a sense of lack of opportunity, and in fact may be creating one. But to me, the most pernicious aspect of growing inequality has to do with the public sector. Something that Elizabeth Warren refers to quite a bit, as I said before. When you have more and more inequality, you end up with a segment of the population near the top that just doesn't want to, they don't want to pay money for everybody else. They're less interested in this notion of we or us versus me and mine. They want to pay less taxes that pay for other people's children's schools, roads, prisons, and even police protection. And in part, they can because they can just buy it on their own. You can opt out and buy a private school. You can hire a security guard for your property. I don't know if you can avoid the roads or airports. But I think what this has resulted in the public sector facing a squeeze on the revenue side with this drumbeat to reduce taxes, and also pressure on the spending side, because when you have more inequality, there are more higher needs, and states tend to spend more on have to pick up for the inequality, increase prison populations, more local educational aid, and medical care. State governments do tend to spend more on the poor than do localities and the federal government. But balanced budget requirements and limited tax instruments stretches their fiscal capacities. This creates pressures on state and local governments to squeeze public sector workers and put off needed investments in physical and human infrastructure. And I say this as we sit right next to the red line, all right? I mean, this argument over the red line is an argument over why do we have 50-year-old cars? And why haven't we invested in the public sector? Now, not all, I wouldn't argue all segments of the top argue this. For example, there's a Kendall Square group of high-tech entrepreneurs that have been hammering the legislature and former Governor Patrick to improve the red line. Not surprisingly, to improve public transportation. So it's not all sectors, but I would say that part of one result of inequality has been this tension that has often played out at state and local levels around human infrastructure, which I would argue is education, from early education through K through 12 to higher education to training, and to other forms of care and health provision, such as caring for the elderly, disabled, or provision of mental health services instead of prisons. I mean, I've seen this. I've been at UMass Boston for 25 years, and I've seen it. When I started there, it was something like 65% of all our costs were paid by the state. Now it's less than 50%, and students are paying higher and higher tuition. And so there's been this reduction in some human infrastructure. There's been a growth in Medicaid services. And part of that has to do, I think, with a lot of inability or this notion that we shouldn't raise more revenue, particularly at high income levels. And states' hands are hampered by that. Physical infrastructure includes roads, bridges, but public transportation, internet, and public utilities. These things are expensive when they're privatized, as is childcare and higher ed. But they're crucial to our abilities to participate in civic and public life. And I think that because these are largely provided at the state and local level, I think this may help explain some of Chetty et al.'s results about the regional differences. So I would argue that the inability to keep up with public investments undermines opportunity, but it also erodes confidence in government, which also weakens democracy. So I think inequality plays out in many ways. It's been documented around health issues, et cetera, but and I don't have the evidence, but I would argue that this notion of, and you can see some of it at the federal level, but I think it plays out mostly at the state and local level. So now what? Now if social mobility is not any different, but inequality is, then I think it's time to talk a lot more about inequality in the light of thinking about social mobility. And I've been, and also, so why? I've been more convinced by the evidence around the consolidation of corporate power and its link with what people call neoliberalism, the neoliberal state, as a key driver in the growth of inequality. Certainly there have been technological and geopolitical reasons that have been important, but they can't explain the degree of inequality we've seen in the US. This has all occurred in the context of a very strong narrative of fair inequality, that is, a very strong narrative of personal responsibility, as well as a real reduction in racial and gender barriers, and a tremendous rise in the number of immigrants, especially non-Europeans, to the US. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of strong ideological counter stories to the steady rise in inequality that complicate the story. But I would say one main result of corporate ascendancy as in our political system is that, and we see it in terms of what the neoliberal state typically is identified as doing, promoting free trade, reduce government regulation and spending. And there's been a tendency towards that. And it's taken place in the context of rising inequality. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about this later, but also a notable change in the quality of jobs for many. Those facing the largest economic losses have in fact been white men, as deindustrialization has brought a decline in higher paying manufacturing jobs and a rise in low-wage work. They don't have the lowest wages, they just have seen the largest losses in income. So income inequality is as much a political struggle over the control over resources as an economic imperative. I would argue that this has been a response to the rise of corporate power, and the neoliberal state can be understood as a political response to one of the strongest post-World War II social contracts in place, the sharing of U.S. economic growth with U.S. workers. And this only came about because workers organized in the 1930s, and that's the graph you have. I think the most telling graph of the feedback loop of economic inequality is, if you have it, I think there was one, is this graph of the distinction between, it's right here, and I guess I should describe it. It's a graph that, it's a simple graph. It maps the cumulative percent change in productivity from essentially 1948 to 2013, and hourly compensation. And the cumulative increase in productivity, output per worker, has steadily increased over this period, over this 60-year period, 55-year period, 65-year period. And virtually identically mapped on the increase in productivity from 1948 to approximately 1978 are hourly compensation. So for every additional widget you produced faster than you had before, there was a compensating wage increase, what some refer to as shared prosperity. But by late 1970s, that line, the hourly compensation, the percent change in hourly compensation narrows, slows, and in fact, hardly rises at all. And in the meantime, productivity increases. And this graph is often used to talk about who's capturing U.S. economic growth. So when productivity grows, there's more stuff being produced, there's more money being made, but it's not being shared among workers versus owners. And so this inequality, I think, leads us, and this understanding of increased productivity without shared growth, to thinking about ways of dealing with inequality. There's also a similar graph. This is done by the Economic Policy Institute. They have a similar graph that looks at this increase in productivity and wages and mapped onto the percentage of the labor force that's unionized. And it's almost identical. As unionization falls, that's the point in which workers' share stops growing. So I would say, particularly in today's political situation, economic situation, the role of organized labor not only is one for improving wages, but it provides an important countervailing power to corporate power, an important way to combat the concentration of power, and with it the ability to finance campaigns through lobbying or elections, is through parallel mobilizations. And those can only be taken through collectivized forces like unions. So I think unions not only have an important role to play for improving inequality by improving wages, but there's an important political role they play as a countervailing force to corporate power. As someone who studies poverty, especially among women, I welcome a real debate around the structural impediments to moving out of poverty. For too long, poor women have been blamed for their own poverty. So I welcome this, although I have to say I'm afraid that the national debate has focused more on the middle class than it has on the poor. And that's a talk for another day. But it has opened the door to talk more about unfair inequality, that those that are trying hard should not face undue impediments and deserve a modicum of reward. It's called into question the cost of higher public education, the cost of childcare, and why our prisons are so full of men of color. I think it's created a new space to question and combat inequality. But history reveals that it's not only through organized voices, that change happens. When workers, as well as key constituencies, have borne the burden of inequality, collectively confront constricting opportunities caused by high levels of inequality, is when change does happen. So I'm talking about coalitions around low-wage workers, students, current and former incarcerated people, poor people, people of color, immigrants, all of those who have been at the bottom rungs of these ladders and who have been facing impediments, and I think are ready to be organized, if not already. I think also, though, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier, is that it's going to take some reconfiguration, though, of these forces. It'll begin with traditional forms, such as unions or religious groups, but it'll take new forms. For example, those of us in Massachusetts who watched the market basket workers align with their owner to shut it down. This was a pretty unusual labor move, and I think one that maybe not is the example we want to take, but it does show there are different ways to organize. I think the powerful Rise Up Massachusetts coalition of union, community, and religious groups that that got the minimum wage increased by the threat of initiative petition and got us paid sick days in Massachusetts is another example. And those Moral Monday protests in North Carolina are other examples. So we've never been, nor will we ever become a meritocracy, I don't think. That is around this notion of social mobility. Economic opportunity, and with it social and economic mobility, has been systematically denied to groups of people in the U.S., indeed blocked, with very different sets of opportunities being part of the social contract. Housing, jobs, colleges placed restrictions based on race, religion, and gender up until the 1970s. But it's only when confronted politically through the civil rights movement and the women's movement that these barriers start to be removed, and I would argue, and so it will be again. And that's my optimistic note.
So thank you for that. There's a lot of information in there for us to dig into. No, it was great. You started to touch on the connection to organized labor in addressing these issues and saying that we need some new forms of that. And I want to connect a couple pieces. You also talked about the fact that we have, in a situation where there's rising inequality, that everybody does worse. So if we were to address this inequality question, that in fact communities then do better across the board. Everybody in the community, those who are at the higher end of the spectrum and the lower end of the spectrum. But you also mentioned, which I find really interesting, that it seems like we're dealing with increasingly a pea and shell game that is absolutely stacked against low wage or poverty level people in this country. So just to kind of tie some of those together in an example, you might hear Local 26. In the past 15 years, room attendants, which is the largest category, we represent workers in the hospitality industry. Room attendants clean the rooms in the hotels. Their hourly wage has gone up from $12 an hour to almost $20 an hour today, which is a significant increase, and I think it outpaces the increases that people would see in other areas, except for that top 1%.
Right. It certainly outpaces.
It certainly outpaces what's on there, right?
Yeah.
And what's funny about this graph, I'll just comment about it briefly. When I first saw it without looking at the title, I thought, oh, that's actually comparing healthcare prices to wages.
Okay.
Because it's almost the exact same thing.
Or college prices.
Or college prices.
That's right.
And that gets to the point, which is that even though we are able to increase wages for people and we've been able to get them benefits and do all sorts of things, and I think people are seeing some improvements in their lives and their communities are getting better, they're still facing these pressures of increased costs of education, increased costs of healthcare.
And housing, too.
Increased cost of housing and everything across the board.
That's right.
So I guess the other piece that you mentioned is that we have lots of different ways of cutting up the pie and looking at what's happening and keeping people divided from each other, whether it's on a racial basis, whether it's by gender, whether it's by sexual orientation, whether it's, who knows? I mean, you can name all sorts of different things. What do you think is the critical issue to focus on?
I think there are two. That is, I think there's something to the 1%, right? That is that the Occupy movement, I think, had it right in a way to focus on the 1%, and then Piketty and et al. With their data show that. That is, that there have been both political and economic structures that have allowed a very small group of people to have a very lot of money. So I think there's certainly ways to go about that, and I think the best way to do it is through taxation. I know that Piketty argues against that, but that's where the money is. So I think there has to be some focus there. But I don't want to give undue attention to that, because I actually think that the bottom half matters a lot. And as I said, I think that how you feel inequality matters where you are on the scale of things. And so, I'm a pretty big proponent of a dual strategy. One is an employment strategy, the other is a public sector strategy. And the employment strategy has to be one in which, you know, we have to lift wages at the bottom, primarily, I would argue first. And also secure certain employment minimums. So, for example, this issue about the group that was able to move up that had more job flexibility. Low-wage workers have no job flexibility, or their employer has tremendous job flexibility, and they have none. And that plays havoc with people's lives. And so there's legislation that is on the books in some states, and England has passed some of that requires employers to at least post hours, you know, ahead of time, or to pay a minimum amount if you don't use a worker for more than a couple of hours. So I think there are employment minimums, like paid sick days, around flexibility, that matter, and wages. But I also think there's a public sector investment that we have been missing for a while, particularly at, well, in this human infrastructure. And I would argue that not just children, but elders too. I mean, we privatize the cost of care in the United States. And that disproportionately falls on, actually, it disproportionately falls on women when it's unpaid, and it disproportionately falls on women of color when it's paid, because that's who does the care work. And it's very poorly paid because it's not profitable. So there has to be a public sector strategy that invests in essentially human infrastructure, the taking care of people from essentially 3 to when they die, in ways that other countries do and are standing and doing well. So that's, I don't know, that's sort of a long answer, but that would be, if I were to design the policies, that's where I'd look.
So just a quick response to that. It's interesting, when you say the phrase, that's where the money is,
yeah.
when you do taxation, it makes me think of the old joke of, why did you rob the bank? Well, that's where the money is.
Yeah, yeah.
So we have to figure out some way of...
Yeah. Oh, we know how to do it. We know how, there's estate taxes, there's income taxes. I mean, there are ways to do this. It's just there hasn't been much of a political will to do it, and a lot of threats around doing it by corporations, et cetera.
So I mentioned to you just on the other comment about the social policy that you think needs to be in place to help take care of people. I think tied up in this, I mentioned I was a student of Ivan Illich, and Ivan used to say, you know, there's this increasing gap between rich and poor, but I'm not so worried about that. What I'm worried about is that it's become increasingly difficult to live as a poor person. Yeah. And I think that's part of the pressure that we have to figure out how to relieve.
And some of the big costs, as you talked about before, are care work, right? Child care. I mean, in the United States, we fund very, very poor people. We provide some child care for them through Head Start. We provide some tax benefits. But there's a very, very wide swath of people that are paying out of pocket for both higher ed and childcare. And both of them, in fact, childcare can be more than higher ed depending on where you are. And both of those are what we would consider really important investments in people's ability to not just be civic participants, but their economic investments. Most other countries pay, industrialized countries pay for them, and those are really high costs. The other, of course, is housing, I think, that becomes a huge cost as well. And that we subsidize people who buy their houses through the interest deduction on their mortgage. Right, and that's more expensive than what we spend on public housing. So we do subsidize. The question is, how do we do it, and who gets it? And I'm not necessarily arguing. And in some ways, I think this notion of the middle class squeeze is correct, in the sense that we've been averse at taxing the high end, right? And I think both the federal and state governments have been really good over the last 30 years about not taxing the bottom. But if you're going to spend money, it's got to come from somewhere. And so it does come from this, from the 20 to the 80%. And I think people do feel squeezed by that. And what I'm saying is we need to squeeze some at the top, and we need to collectivize much more of this than just provide Head Start for really poor families. Right? I mean, I actually think we need to think more universally about the sets of goods that we know we want and need. And I would say the first, I think early education, I have to say, I don't understand. I really don't understand why we don't have universal early education care in the United States. I really don't understand it. Because all the evidence shows that it's a really important investment. Most other countries that have the kind of GDP we do have it. And I mean, I've been working on this issue for 30 years, and it's really surprising to me that we don't have that. Universal education and care for kids.
Scandinavian countries where they, rather than having universal early care, they subsidize families to do that themselves.
That's
so
right.
Somebody doesn't have to go to work, so they can stay home and take care of the
That's right,
children.
but everybody wants to send their 3-year-old out of the house. Even people with free care do. And it's good for them. I mean, there's lots and lots of studies that show that, being socialized and being with other kids. So yes, I agree. And that's paid family leave on one end. And that's an employment benefit. That's what I mean. There should be some minimums. And again, I mean, the paid maternity leave is an embarrassment. I think there are only 3 other countries in the world that don't have paid maternity leave, including Lesotho and I forget who else. So, I mean, there's sort of this U.S. exceptionalism that I actually think is fueled by this American dream stuff. That is, because we're so exceptional, anybody can make it, so we don't have to pay for that. Just work hard, you'll get there.
So just building on that, what are the other barriers that you think exist to low-income women, women of color, immigrant women, to get ahead and to fully participate in our democracy?
Well, certainly this lack of paying for care work, I think it's a double whammy for low-income women who are care workers, right? They can't take care of their own kids, but they're caring for other people's kids or parents at very low wages. CNAs, the certified nursing assistants, are notorious for having several jobs because it's not enough to make enough, and they can't take care of their own kids. So the first place I would say that would help is beginning to subsidize some care work. But also, I mean, the minimum wage helps. The paid sick days are certainly going to help those workers disproportionately. So we're already doing some of that. It's just painfully slow and step by step. Right, so Massachusetts has paid sick days, right? Some other states may. I mean, it's really a state by state type of thing.
And what do you think are the barriers to organizing? Because a lot of what you just mentioned in terms of employment standards and paid sick days and increased wages are things that we actually have had as part of union contracts for many years.
That's right. That's right.
But organizing is extremely difficult, and the more successful we become, the more the employers resist.
That's right.
Because labor costs go up. And,
That's right.
you know, I was mentioning the example right now is that just across the river, Harvard University owns the Doubletree Hotel, where the women are trying to organize, and there has been a tremendous amount of resource put into fighting the women organizing there.
Right. That's like Walmart. If they get one unionized, they're afraid that, I mean, I think for Doubletree, that's probably their strategy. But, I mean, you can answer this as well as I can. Certainly the labor laws are...
It's your turn. It's your turn to answer.
Certainly labor laws have really made it very, very difficult for unions to organize, right? The NLRB rulings. Certainly there's been enormous amounts of resistance. I mean, unions I mean, there has been growth in service sector unionization and decline in other places. I mean, I think that workers can mobilize in a lot of ways. And I think ultimately unions are a model that works. But certainly the market basket workers are fine until Demoulas moves on and sells out, right? And that's the problem with not having a union, is right? They have to depend on him. So, you know, at this point, I'm actually as concerned about reductions in organized labor, particularly public sector, right? I mean, Scott Walker has made a career now out of trying to reduce the power of, or just reduce public sector workers. So I'm going to leave that to the unions.
I'm just remembering my grandfather, who we were so proud of him. He was such a union man. And he never would move into management. He never wore a white-collar shirt. He had 2 PhD sons. One of them never wore a white-collar shirt in honor of him. And now I feel that it's shocking, but in my family I hear it. Unions are vilified. I just do not like that about what's happened. So that's just my comment.
Why do you think that, thank you, it's a great comment, but why do you think that has happened? It does seem like there's been a very successful PR campaign to vilify unions.
Well, I think a lot about, when I think about vilification, I think about single mothers a lot, because there was a campaign to vilify them, a successful one. And I think that the vilification of unions comes about because I think sometimes they're perceived as greedy, they're perceived as bosses, they're perceived as of reducing flexibility at work, not increasing it. So I think there's particularly workers are told this, that you don't want a union because what they'll do is they'll make it harder for you to move up or do this. It's sort of this very interesting, and in some ways it's just the opposite. Where I work, we actually have a union, and one thing that the union does that's really important is it sets up procedures, and it makes transparent a set of procedures, and which helps everybody. And so there's this opposite notion that they create barriers or more bureaucracy, et cetera, that takes away from workers, or that workers don't get things from them. So, I mean, I don't study this in particular, but one reason we don't have as many unions is because the places that were unionized aren't around as much. I mean, they're just the deindustrialization, the loss of manufacturing jobs. So, but the vilification, I'm not sure.
Well, I would just throw in before I ask my question, often unions are perceived as corrupt.
Yeah.
And that, sometimes they are corrupt. So that, but that's just another factor in your long list. I have a question about the new forms of organizing and the new forms that unions are taking. I mean, you mentioned manufacturing industry is declining, and that's where the current model, the major model of unions was constructed. And certainly they evolved from the 19th century up through the 30s and the 50s. And Joey is working with service sector unions, which had to struggle to find a way to organize because there wasn't a factory to be based in, there wasn't a mining industry to be based in. And you talked about the need to organize, the need to have an organized voice to counteract corporate power, to counteract the power of the 1%, the power of the lobbyists. What other ways can people organize?
Well, I gave the example of the Moral Mondays in North Carolina that have spread actually to other states, which was actually led by, he's the head of the NAACP in North Carolina. He's also a minister of some, but it's been this large coalition of various groups that have done that. I mean, again, the benefit of unions is that people sign cards. I mean, they don't literally sign cards, but they become members through an institution in which they stay with for as long as they can, employment. And contracts are, they have contracts with employers, et cetera. So there's these very formal mechanisms that keep them together that I think some of these other groups don't have, right? Religious coalitions have different kinds of imperatives and way they work, but they may not have the same kind of lasting power as a union might because of that. So I think there are various forms of this, and like I said, I use Massachusetts because we're here, but the Raise Up Massachusetts Coalition worked very well. I mean, they had come together, actually, they had worked together before to combat the initiative petitions that wanted to get rid of the sales tax and reduce income taxes. So this very coalition actually had been together fighting sort of these retrograde fights, and came together to actually do these more positive fights. And I actually think that in some ways that victory was a lot sweeter than the victory that said we didn't get rid of the sales tax. So I think working for more positive things matters. Again, it's not what I spend a lot of time studying, but I think people have less time to participate in organizations, particularly low-wage workers, are incredibly pressed for time. And people with children, young children, are also, or even older children, are incredibly pressed for time. So there's, one way to organize might be through schools, right? I mean, I just think there are lots of different ways that people can be creative to push for some of this. But I think part of the struggle is to get rid of some of these ideological barriers that the reason why you're not doing well is because you have some inherent problem yourself. And in that way, I'm kind of happy that there's this discussion around economic mobility, because it does, I think it frees us up to think about other barriers that people face.
I'm just going to respond real quickly to that, which is that I think that there are a lot of students that are increasingly getting involved in organizing at this point in time. A lot of it's around debt issues that is really encouraging. But there have been a lot of students that are becoming much more savvy about how universities are really economic institutions and how they're using their investments to drive certain behaviors that they want to figure out how to change, including students at Harvard that have been involved in the DoubleTree campaign that I mentioned before, which has been really encouraging. There's also increasingly an understanding of communities about the difference that it makes to get organized. So we as a union try to figure out how to connect with the communities more, because we recognize that our members live in those communities, and if we can get more wages into their pockets, that actually helps the community. An example is that over on Hendry Street, which was one of these really hard-hit streets in Boston by the housing bubble bursting, where you had, I forget what the percentage was, but a ridiculous number of foreclosures on the street. One of our members actually moved into the street and started fixing up the housing, and then we got city programs involved, and they did all sorts of things, and that street has really turned around now as a result of it. So communities are kind of recognizing that and have increasingly become supportive of the organizing efforts. Where we see it specifically is when new hotels are being built, or when we're getting into conversations about the casinos coming. People talk about them being built union, but there's a question about what about the jobs after they're built? And people are starting to increasingly understand that those make a big difference for the communities also. If the Olympics come to Boston, which people have lots of different thoughts and feelings about that, but if they do come, I think it's important that we understand that we want to pay a good wage to the people who are working there for the permanent jobs. And we had a question here.
Well, it's more of a comment. About a year or two ago, there was an article in the New York Times by Charles Blow talking about upward mobility in the United States compared to other countries. And it was quite shocking to me to see that the United States was way down on the list. And I don't know how that reflects on your discussion, but it was well below Spain and Portugal and England and so forth. Are you concerned at all about this Uber model, where that is spreading apparently to other situations, so that the worker is available but not fully employed and is at the beck and call of the organization?
Yeah, and that actually brings to mind another form of organizing, which is worker cooperatives. So Uber's called this sharing economy, but it's not shared at all. The guys that run Uber make all the money, and you're right, it's sort of like, these contract workers, that independent contractors that catch as catch can, that also undermine, other workers. So yeah, that model I'm not too crazy about, but if it were a worker cooperative, then I might want to think about it in a different way, and so I have yet to sign up for Uber myself, even though taking a cab to the airport's really expensive. But yes, I think it's another case of the owners sort of posing. I mean, it's self-imposed flexibility. I can drive whenever I want, but it's not the model I would do. But it does raise this question, I know, and unions have gone back and forth on worker cooperatives, but there have been some successes, particularly in Springfield. There's been some in Cleveland. There's been a growth in interest in collectives, in worker collectives. Particularly the Cleveland ones I find particularly interesting because they've been mostly in low-income communities. So one of the more successful ones is around laundry service and it's for the hospitals and the colleges in the Cleveland area. And so here these nonprofits that don't pay property taxes, right? And that they've been able to negotiate these contracts using pretty low, sort of what we used to call lumpen, people who just were on the reserve army, if you will, and setting up cooperatives in which workers are owners. There's one that's starting in Boston around recycling too, Credo. So that, I hadn't thought about that until you raised this Uber question, because I'd thought about it in that context. But that's another
Just
format.
Crust, which is the worker-owned pizza place here.
Oh, right. Yeah. So that's another model. We tried that though, right? In the 60s and 70s.
So thank you for your comments. Inequality and problems of mobility have a lot of different causes, as you mentioned. One of them has been touched on in part, but I'd like to get your reaction to it, because it seems to me it may deserve a bit more attention, and that is the loss of manufacturing jobs in this country. This has accelerated over time. It's been a huge problem in the last 10 or 15 years. But Manufacturing, of course, is the bedrock of unionism, as we've discussed, and in addition to that, it's been the important part of the economic ladder that has allowed immigrants and low-wage workers to gain skills and to move upward on the economic and social ladder. And it's been the foundation of the whole economy of the Midwest. It's been important to African American communities. And if you take that out of the picture, as really to such a substantial degree has been done, and not be able to replace it with anything else, it seems to me to be a crucial missing link in the issue of inequality and mobility and progress for low-skilled workers. Because now there's this huge bifurcation of jobs in this country, with the manufacturing having gone largely to China, and there's nothing really to replace that piece of the ladder, the crucial piece for upward mobility. And I wanted to know if you sort of shared the sense that this is really quite important.
Well, it's important, but I'm not sure it's important for the reasons that, for economic growth. That is, those same manufacturing jobs were pretty lousy in the turn of the 20th century. They only became good jobs in the 1930s when they became unionized. And so in some ways, and as they became unionized, the deal was you had to increase productivity. So those particular jobs didn't really grow. Manufacturing was a larger share of employment in the 50s and 60s. But if you look at the numbers of people in manufacturing didn't grow. It actually stayed fairly constant. But those jobs became good jobs. And I think there's an argument around the fast food organizing, et cetera, that we can make these better jobs as long as there's increases in productivity or their shared prosperity. So I'm not so sure it's the nature of manufacturing jobs themselves, but whether those jobs are good jobs versus not. And we have plenty of manufacturing jobs that aren't good jobs. And Massachusetts actually used to have a whole bunch of them that weren't good jobs for a long time. So the one thing I do think that manufacturing matters, that makes it harder to organize in service sectors, is that we can really measure productivity, and it's easier to mechanize and get productivity, as opposed to how do you make a certified nurse assistant more productive? Does she have to go and do more, 5 more people a day, or spend less time with them? Or how do I become more productive as an educator? And I think there's a difficulty there that I think we don't think as much with manufacturing. So I actually think it matters, but not for the same reason you do. I do think it helps explain a rise in inequality, particularly among male workers, both white and black, because that's who we're mostly in those jobs. And the loss of those jobs has had an impact, particularly when you look at those wages. So I agree with you. I think it's been a cause of inequality. But I think that those jobs were so good because they were made good. They didn't come good, let me put it that way. Yeah. The unions really made those jobs better jobs.
I have another question related to the previous comment, and that is the idea of the career ladder, which large manufacturing enterprises created. I mean, there were enough jobs and enough different kinds of jobs and enough incentives probably brought into light by the unions so that people could move up, and it wasn't just a matter of getting a raise in wages every year, but you could actually rise in status. But some of the service sector jobs don't seem to have that. I mean, higher education does, except when you're an adjunct forever.
Right.
But when you're a hotel room cleaner, or when you're a certified nursing assistant, what is the career ladder, and how can organizing help create those ladders?
there are some career ladders in hospitality. Yes. I mean, there certainly are, and there are even some in elder care, et cetera, although there aren't as many, and there aren't as many in higher ed as you would think. I mean, you know, but hospitals are another place that there for low-wage workers there are some ladders. So it's not that there aren't ladders. The question is how big are the steps. And I think what unions were able to do and are able to do is to really define those steps and make the rungs higher. So that when you do move up or you're there for 5 years or the experience, you get rewarded for them. I think sometimes, you know, in some of these low-wage workers, you get a promotion from being you know, an hourly worker to a salary worker, and actually you end up with less hourly pay because you end up having to work more hours. So I think that there are some of the rungs. The question is how are they structured and who gets to say those structures. And again, I think it's not an economic imperative that we have jobs that don't have rungs. We make jobs. We form jobs. The jobs are historically created in historic, you know, we assume who's fit for jobs. Those can all be changed and negotiated and created in different ways. So I don't think, you know, we're not stuck in what a job has to be. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to sound like a wobbly now for a minute.
Yeah.
I think that it's what you're talking about is certainly that's happened. I think that that's a residual of craft unionism and the idea that we want to create this fair inequality that people have the ability to move. And it's a strange idea to me that we're somehow going to inherently value the work of somebody who, so in the hotel industry, for example, people who are doormen or people who are working on the coffee crew, helping set up banquets for meetings and that sort of thing, tend to make more money. A lot of it's based on gratuity, but they make a lot more money than somebody who's washing the dishes. Why are we inherently valuing the person who is going and setting the plates as opposed to the person who's cleaning those plates and making sure that they're presentable? And I think that that's kind of this residual craft unionism idea. And I am a big advocate of trade unionism, which is that across the board we want to figure out how to bring people together and raise the boat for everyone. That said, we do want to have some sense of mobility so that the people who, you know, some people are going to be better at doing coffee crew work and some people are going to be better at doing dishes. And we want to get people into the right slots, but everybody should be able to live on whatever it is that they're doing and adding value, especially when you look at the profits that are being made in the hospitality industry. It's absurd.
And I'm not against fair inequality either. I mean, what's the range, right? I mean, how much, you know, why, you know, I mean, you can think about it at the other end. Why is it that CEOs are worth, you know, as much as they are? They don't have that much value added. I mean, they just don't. I mean, you know, many of them don't. So why is it that they get paid so much? You know, why is that ladder so steep while the dishwasher, I mean, I guarantee the dishwashers probably speak less English than the others, but I mean, there may be some sorting that's going out there too. And historically, there's been sorting for that kind of job. But so, and you do want to keep workers.
But those are the arguments that, I mean, when we're talking about the textile industry getting organized, which, you know, 1912, the Lawrence textile strike is a famous one. Right. There was an attempt to really divide the workers who were the skilled trades as opposed to those who were the unskilled trades. Yeah. And that's part of the problem that kept them from getting organized for a long time. And it was the CIO model that you're referring to in the 1930s that actually finally brought people together and were able to move everyone together.
That's right.
To what extent do you think globalization has affected inequality and also the loss of jobs in certain industries? I mean, people can get priced out of industries. That's right. IT even, or, you know, certainly labor and manufacturing.
That's right.
To what extent has that affected inequality itself by making, you know, the lowest income people can find jobs because you can't send service away yet, anyway.
Not yet, or not all of it. I mean, I think and that's been promoted in some ways by the free trade, right? I mean, how do you globalize and who gets to move and who doesn't? And it certainly has been disruptive. And I think it has, you know, as I said, it's not that globalization or even technical changes hasn't contributed to inequality. I think it has. It's just the degree of inequality can't be explained merely by that. And you brought this up with other countries. I mean, we have a lot more inequality in the U.S. and a lot less mobility from other countries that have also experienced globalization. So I think it's contributed to inequality, but I don't think it explains a lot of why we have so much. So it's, again, I don't want to, not say that it's not important, but and let me leave it at that. And manufacturing is a lot easier to send away than as you say, some services.
Just one comment. I heard Bernie Sanders, Senator of Vermont, talk about inequality, and he stated that there are 25 hedge fund CEOs who each make over $1 billion or close to $1 billion and earn more money than 435,000 school teachers in the United States. So that's,
yeah, and what's important?
This is slightly, but it really isn't off the subject, but the scary part for me is when you say it's going to affect it affects everyone, because global warming is a subject that the lower class people would speak about if they had time. But they don't have time, and the mothers with children don't have time, so they don't even. Anyway, so we're all going to suffer from this really terribly. Yeah. Are we? Yeah.
So I think we're coming to our time here. I do have one last question for you, and coming off of that, that's a great segue, which is to turn that around and say, where do you find hope?
Well, I guess I find hope in the Raise Up Massachusetts Coalition. I find hope in the Fast Food 15 campaign. This has been an effort to organize fast food workers to earn $15 an hour, which is sort of interesting because it sort of came from the workers themselves. I think they kind of leapfrogged the unions in a way around this. And then there's been all this work by various people about how it might increase your hamburger by 3 cents or something if fast food workers were paid $15 an hour. So it's so I find some here right at home. Mm-hmm. I find some hope in that. I just think historically, well, was it the arc of justice bends, and I do think that this notion increasingly that many people cannot pay for college. They have a hard time starting out getting housing. They can't. They feel like they're constrained in their own employment choices because of childcare costs, et cetera. Creates a different dialogue, and so that's where my hope lies.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Randy Albelda. That concludes the portion.
Thank you.